It's springtime in 1974 in Santa Clara, California, and we're ramping up for a beautiful spring season in our friendly little neighborhood community where the plum blossoms are blooming and we're all living the California dream. It was a time that when you went to the local market, you connected with most of your neighbors, and your grocery shopping took longer because you would run into so many people, friends, neighbors, schoolmates. But this particular spring day in March was like no other neighborhood conversation, as the news had just broke out that 3 bodies were found in a small crawl space underneath a nearby home. Everybody was locking their doors and looking over their shoulder in fear of who could have done this. Who were these individuals that were buried under the home? How did they get there? And who did this horrific crime? Welcome to episode 1 of Investigated. This is the story of the Pearson Family Murders.
You better be watching. You better be watching in the dark. You better be watching.
Mr. Pearson invited me into the house, and I thought for a second, knowing what I know now, I could have been the 4th bag under the house.
I was the main witness. I had to tell them about everything that I found and that I felt that they were under the house. And stared me down, and I just looked right back at them.
I'm Sonya Paz.
And I'm Mark Kospchik.
And we are your host of Investigated. I'm Sonya Paz.
And I'm Mark Kospchik.
And we are your host of Investigated. In this podcast, we're going to be discussing and talking a lot about true crime and murder and motives and things like that. So it is in its best interest, if you are sensitive to this topic, or if you have other people in the room while listening to this that don't want to hear, then you might just want to have discretion while listening. I'm really excited that we had the opportunity to really get this podcast online in record time. And I think that's pretty remarkable, don't you?
I think so as well. I think we've had a lot of fun doing this. I think we're excited about the audience listening to the case and cases we're going to delve into. And I think they're going to learn a lot about the legal system, the justice system, and the ins and outs of kind of what really happens behind the scenes, in a sense of how things are investigated, because I think police have a tendency to have tunnel vision on their cases, and that's what they get paid for. Whereas when you do defense investigation, you look for the whole picture. And that's the unique thing about this podcast, is the way you have come about looking into this case is the big picture. It's not just what happened with Pearson. It's not how he got into trouble, how he was arrested, went to trial, was accused, did prison time. This is everything kind of behind the scenes. I mean, everybody will get a good fill of the case, but they'll also get a lot of background that wasn't there in the initial investigation. Right.
And, back then, I'm showing my age here, but back then in newspapers, the style of news reporting was incredibly different than what we have today.
Absolutely.
We have websites now. We have people who blog. We have other podcasters telling true crime stories and writers and that kind of thing. Back in the newspaper industry, you're given a space, and whatever fills that space to fill that page is kind of where they go. Someone might have a story that could be 2 pages long, and they're only given a 2-inch by 4-inch column to basically summarize. Of course, if it's bigger, they'll say continued on page, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But it's very brief. And in this story in particular, especially since I have a personal connection to it, I wanted to hear all of the details. And that's pretty much what started me down this rabbit hole of digging deeper, bigger, better, faster, stronger kind of thing.
Right.
But with all of the information that I had, and I knew that there was more, this is when I reached out to you, my friend of 30 plus years who does fantastic work and has been my go-to person for asking all kinds of different questions over the years. You know, my inquiry to you is, there's got to be more, and you pointing me in the right direction was a huge asset.
I was really glad that Sonya contacted me about this case because it was so intriguing to me after she told me what had happened with her, because she was actually involved in the case as a small child. The murders back in 1974 were interesting in that law enforcement investigated it, but they never were able to locate or find the suspect for many, many years. Sonya asked me, so how do we go about resurrecting this old case and finding out some new information? We talked about a lot of areas to cover. I gave her some guidance and some investigative hints as to what to do, where to look, how to get court records, how to maybe get appeal hearings, where to look. And she took it from there and went crazy and found out a lot of new information.
And I'm really glad I did, because that is just the fuel that I needed to get my butt in gear to start really putting the pieces together so that this story can be told on behalf of the victims. Let's talk for just a moment about who is Mark and who is Sonya. Give our listeners a little bit of insight of who we are and why we're doing this podcast. Let's talk about what you do in your daily as far as your job being a private investigator.
Well, so I started my career as a public defender investigator in Seattle, Washington, working for the public defender's office there doing defense work. And that eventually led to me opening up my own business up in Seattle, which I did for 7 years, and then came down here to Southern California, worked for several different agencies, both public and private. And then probably about 25 years ago, I decided to go back to private investigation and doing PI work and defense work for attorneys around Southern California.
Wow.
And my daily routine can be anything from working on murder cases to kidnap cases to sexual assault cases, pretty much Class A felony stuff. A lot of the work I've done in Southern California has also been high-profile stuff, things we've heard on the news or things that have been covered worldwide. So those are pretty interesting and always have twists and turns in those cases. So it's never a dull moment. I think that's why I continue on doing what I do, because I love the work.
Yeah. And it's nothing's cookie cutter either. You know, it's not like you do this case is the same as the next case as the next case.
No, and it really isn't. The players are always different. The facts are always a little different, and which keeps it fresh. Well,
just in this case alone, you had guided me in the right direction, and I had also been in touch with a friend of mine named Clark Williams. He's a criminologist. He heard about my story, and he was able to offer me some insight, because that's what he does, is digs and digs and digs. And he was able to produce to me a couple of articles that I had not found. So that was pretty interesting.
That's what's really interesting this day and age, is there's so much social media that you can dig into that you can literally spend hours and hours just sitting at your desk mulling over everything that's available on the internet to comb and get good background. But as you know, and what I think you've learned from this case, is hitting the streets on your feet, talking to people personally instead of over the phone, takes you a lot farther in creating a true investigation as far as covering everything.
Oh, yeah. One of the things I have found is when you call and you ask and you just get right to the point in a kind, real, friendly fashion of what you're looking for and what you're doing, people are really receptive to understand. I found that have just from all of the different government offices have been really helpful. I would say a majority of them have been really helpful, and that's been surprising and really just interesting. And I feel thankful, and I feel like, my friend Marianne is kind of on my shoulder telling me, don't be discouraged, keep going, tell my story. So here we are.
Learned that throughout the years too, that when you as a person ask for help, whether it's getting a hold of a court clerk and asking to get documents, and if you're, like you said, nice about it, you tell them what they want, and that you actually ask them, hey, I really need your help, that people always are willing to help. That's, I think, human nature. Mm-hmm. So we all know that Sonya does art, and that's her go-to, but all of a sudden she got so interested in doing this piece on Marianne's family that that's taken a lot of time. Are you still doing all your art stuff?
Oh, yeah. Those are the hours I don't sleep or when I'm not investigating the story. So I sling paint for a living. I paint paintings. I've had my own galleries. I've done everything in the art world probably that is legal and possible. No, I'm kidding. I've done everything in the art world. I mean, I have done the whole art and wine festivals, had my own studio, had my own gallery, opened up another bigger, better gallery after that. And it's just been a wild ride over the last 20 years. I have had a retail product line of articles and things, ceramics, watches, jewelry, textiles, pillows, coasters, prints, originals, yada, yada. And enough to fill 2,300 square feet of just all my own stuff. But that is what I do in my daily job. That is what I do to make a living. And in 2015, I started a company called Vino Paint, where I teach large groups of people in social settings how to create and how to paint. And that's been a wild ride too. So it's been crazy. I would say all of my jobs I've ever had have been on the creative side. And but back last November, as you know, I was working late, and working late doesn't mean like 10 or 11. Working late, maybe I should call it working early, because it was like 1 or 2 in the morning, and that Boston song came on, More Than a Feeling, and that song always takes me back to Marianne, because there's a verse in there, see my Marianne walking away.
Right. That
always just comes into my memories. So this particular evening back at the end of November, I thought, gosh, I got to find out. I really need to investigate this story. So I ended up going online, and through an auction site, I found the FBI poster of James Arthur Pearson. And I thought, gosh, that's kind of eerie. Especially 2 in the morning. Gosh, here's this guy, And the face and the whole description, it just catapulted me back to when I was a little kid. And I thought, if I'm going to tell the story, I got to do it now.
Yeah.
But one interesting thing that I do remember is when I was little, Marianne, who was the younger daughter, of course, and we'll get into the whole story here, but she was very creative and very sweet, and she would draw and doodle, and she would draw these perfect stars. And me being 8 and not very seasoned in my drawing at the time, tried to emulate that, and I just got frustrated that I could not get the stars to look exactly alike, like uniform, one after the other. And she would tell me, just practice. And that has stuck with me my entire life after that. So every time I draw a star or doodle or paint one in a painting, I think of Marianne. So I would say that the story and my artwork go hand in hand at this point.
That's cool. You have something to reflect on every time you start doing a project.
Yeah. So there's a lot of content in this story, and it certainly did not warrant a single episode or episode 2 or 3. This is going to be a multi-series episode. I have had the opportunity to talk with a lot of people who remember the case, which is really remarkable because this case didn't happen a year or 2 ago. The crime took place in 1969, but they didn't find Marianne, Pauline, or Paula until March of 1974. So finding people that remember it and are willing to talk to me, and how just hearing about what I'm doing has really sparked their memory. And a few people have called me back and said, hey, I remember this other thing, or I really want to talk to you because this story has haunted me for decades. So I think the gratitude of the folks that I've spoke with so far has really, really fueled me to get this out. And I want to get it out with as much detail as possible.
And the interesting thing about this whole case is that it seems like everywhere you turn and everything we do, we get another little piece of the puzzle of the case behind the scenes. And I think that may even continue as we continue the podcast, that there are going to be new things that come up, possibly even from our listeners that may know something about this and put us down another roadway to check into.
We are going to be getting into the story, I promise, but I just want to mention and preface this by saying that I had the opportunity to speak with Pauline Pearson's nephew the other day, and he had given me some great advice. We had spoke for a while about the case, and I had shared with him that I had a lot of reservations and a lot of fear of talking about the really gruesome way that my friend and her mom and her sister had been killed. And his words of advice were, if you're going to tell the story, tell the whole story. Don't shy away from all of the details, because people need to know what a horrible way that they died at the hands of James Arthur Pearson.
My point exactly, that we will air these podcasts and segments, and people will listen, and they may get a spark, and they can definitely reach out to us. They can also have all kinds of different questions, I'm sure, about not only this case, but about any other cases that we may talk about in the future.
Right. Yeah. And I know you've got some doozies that, that we will be delving into.
Yes, for sure.
So without any further ado, let's get into the life and times of Santa Clara in the 60s and let everyone know how this story started.
I think we're ready to go.
All right, let's do it. So we're going to start this part of the story about how my relationship was with the Pearson family. There are a lot of facets that go along with the story. I think it's really important concept for me to express that these were my friends that were murdered. Based on the fact that this is a personal project and that the Pearson wife and the girls were really good friends of ours, I felt that I wanted to tell the story on the perspective of me being their friend, namely Marianne, who lived next door to us in Santa Clara. They lived next door to us for a couple of years, and we became fast friends. She was about 5 years older than I was. That didn't really hold back the friendship that we had and the bond that we had when I was a small child. So this part of the story is going to be covering everything that I remember from living next door to them in Santa Clara.
When Sonya contacted me about the Pearson murder, she also told me that she did an 8-minute TikTok version of the story and that it had 18,000 views. And since then, we're up to, I think, to 21,000. I told her that maybe she should continue and really dig deep into what's going on with this whole thing, that there's probably many untold stories in this case. So tell us a little bit more about the TikTok thing.
So back in December, on December 21st of 2023, I saw that there was this little trending stitch thing going on in TikTok and thought, well, this is the perfect segue for me to just tell the story about this family who just sort of disappeared one day, and just kind of kept it brief and short. So on the TikTok, it was a stitch based off of a trending stitch. For those of you who've done TikTok will know what I'm talking about. For those who don't, basically, there's these trending videos that you can attach your own story to or your own experience. And so I had done that then to say, hey, everybody, let me tell you this story about what happened to me when I was a kid. So basically in 1968 or 69, we had these neighbors. It was the father, the mother, and the two daughters. And they became really good friends with us because they lived next door to us in Santa Clara, California. We would do things with them. The daughter, Marianne, she would babysit me as a kid. She was friends with my brother. Our families got together. My dad golfed with her dad, and it was, good time. Then they told us the news that they were going to be moving about a mile away behind the Food Villa shopping center. And I was bummed out, but it wasn't far, so it was okay. They were moving to a house that had a swimming pool, and so, there was a lot of fun to be had. I never did get the opportunity to go visit them at the house because they had only lived there for a short time. However, they all of a sudden had to move. The father told us that Pauline and Paula and Marianne had to go back to Pennsylvania for a family emergency, and they had already left. So I was like, oh, okay, well, no phone call from Marianne, no letter, no conclusion, nothing to say, or her to even ride her bike over and say, hey, we're moving. They just sort of happened to poof, disappear one day in the middle of the night. So fast forward to 4.5 years later, my mom and dad get a phone call, and it's one of the detectives with the Santa Clara Police Department, and he wants to come over and talk to my mom and dad. And it was a Saturday. My mom gave me money, told me to go to 7-Eleven, scram, just go out and do something for a while. And I, being the curious child that I was, which, of course, doing this podcast says a lot because things haven't changed, they had talked with these investigators, and I snuck around to the back of the house and kind of ducked under the kitchen window to try to hear what they were talking about. And they were talking about the family. They were talking about something that was found under a home, something that had happened over on Claremont Avenue. They asked my mom and dad if they had any contact from any of the family members between the times that they had moved away from us on Woodhams and moved over to Claremont. Of course, my parents hadn't heard from them, so they didn't have anything to report. And that's when the neighbors started talking, exchanging stories and hearing all different kinds of things. And that's when we also learned that, and this is from my recollection, but I cannot seem to find this in actual documentation, but there was a neighbor that had told my mom that she remembers Marianne going over to the Food Villa, running into the supermarket, finding her mother, being really upset, and dragging her mom out of the store to go home. And that, I don't know who that neighbor was or who told my mom that, but that was a story that had happened. Now, that could have been another time that had happened, because as we start unveiling every layer of this story, you will start to see how things like that were plausible. The other thing that I had mentioned in the TikTok was that I kind of fast forwarded to 4.5 years later, where the termite inspector was under the home doing an inspection, and he had come across the 3 bags with the bodies under the house. And that's when the investigation started. And that was a very short TikTok video explaining the story and what a crazy thing this had happened, where they formerly lived on Claremont Avenue in Santa Clara. Fast forward to about a couple weeks later, I was going through my dad's desk and found a clipping of a news article that had talked about the family being slain, and they had their photos in it. It had Marianne, Paula, and Mrs. Pearson. And I'm about 13 at the time, so I'm literally just shaking because I knew these people and I'd never seen anything like this regarding anybody that I had known personally. I had posted a part 2 on TikTok with some really revealing information that I had learned from my brother. By this time, I thought, I have so much information for a multi-series podcast that I just put it in full gear, and here we are. But in starting this investigation and getting news clippings and talking to people, I was discovering a lot of information that was not published, and a lot of information from the investigating officers at the time that have been able to give me a tremendous amount of really interesting data. I'm glad that I'm tenacious enough to really dig, and I was able to find one of the key witnesses that had been involved in the case. And that was information she provided to me, which we will go into great detail later to talk about from what she had remembered living in Santa Clara at that time. I really need to tell this story because it's certainly much more in depth than a short TikTok video, and of course more in depth than just being an episode. And that's the thing that I wanted to be able to uncover, is what was in the court case files versus what the witnesses and the retired law enforcement that worked on the case back in 1974 was. That I got some really interesting information that was not in the case file, that was not in the testimony, and I feel that it's really important to talk about that. I wanted to delve into all of the details and everything that I could find to tell this story on behalf of Marianne, Paula, and Mrs. Pearson.
That's usually what I find out in my investigations, too. Being concentrated in criminal investigation, you always have your side of your investigation. You have the district attorney's side of the investigation, and then it all comes together during a trial. What's interesting to me is, of all my experiences putting together cases for trial with defense attorneys, it seems like you only get about 70% of what's actually out there based on what the judge allows to come into court as evidence and what he doesn't or she doesn't. And so there's always this remainder of 30% from the defense side and from the prosecution side that doesn't come in because of the way the laws are written. And those are the areas that are more interesting. And I always wonder to myself, if you were to be able to get those 30% into the trial themselves, would the jury have a different outlook or a different verdict? And that's what's interesting about Sonya's story is, I think, because you have a man who was found guilty, but the jury didn't get to hear a lot of what was outside the scope of legal evidence. And Sonya brings that out in the way she did her research and how we're going to bring the podcast to all of you. When the Pearsons moved from being next door to you to the house where they found the bodies, how did that make you feel as a kid? And what was kind of your relationship with them at that point?
Well, the relationship was that Marianne, who I was the most closest to, was 12 when they, around, like 11, 12, 13 when they lived next door to us. So she would babysit me. I was about 8 years old at the time. And they lived next door to us on Woodham's Road for a couple of years. And we would do things together. Our families would get together. My dad would golf with her dad. She would babysit me. My brother was closer to Marianne also. There was about a 4 or 5 year difference between Marianne and her sister Paula. And Paula was the more serious of the two. And Marianne was just, lively, always doing something creative, spent time with me. When I was sick, she would wrap up fruit in foil and give it to me and, just that kind of thing. So there was a good relationship there. I do remember them telling us that they were moving, but Marianne was super excited because it was only a mile away and the house that they were moving to had a swimming pool, and that was sort of the big deal, Wow, we can go swimming at Marianne and Paula's house instead of having to go to the local pool. So there was a lot of things that we did together. And she would even come over and help my mom do things, just hang out in the kitchen and just a variety of different things that were really fun. But I do remember feeling pretty bummed out about the fact that they were, not just next door any longer, but we never did really go over to that house to visit. And there's reasons for that, which I will get into, of course, later when we start unfolding more about the story.
Did you guys go to school together?
No, she was going to a parochial school in Santa Clara, and I went to a different school at the time. So we weren't in the same grade or anything like that, but she ultimately would have went to Cupertino High School, and that's also where Paula went.
We know what happened in 1974, But from your recollection as an 8-year-old kid, what was it from your perspective about the family, about Mr. Pearson, and about the kids that caught your eye, and about Mom?
So, well, having been raised and growing up in Santa Clara, and having the Pearson family living next door, namely Marianne, who babysat me when I was little, and she was someone that I really looked up to. She was a bright ray of sunshine. She was artistic. She was very creative, and she taught me how to draw stars. In fact, every time I draw a star to this day, I automatically think of Marianne. She was just somebody who was just a pleasant girl, really nice young girl. A bright, shining star with her beautiful strawberry blonde hair and a contagious smile. Oh, and they did have 2 small dogs. They lived next door to us from roughly 1967 through 1969 for a couple of years. And then they had told us that they were going to move behind the Food Villa shopping center located in Santa Clara, California. So the Food Villa was the neighborhood go-to shopping grocery store. Pretty much when you shopped there, you would run into at least one person that you knew from the neighborhood. The house that they moved to was probably a bit bigger than where they had lived next door to us. But the house that they moved to had a swimming pool. So as a family with teenage girls, that would be the ultimate awesome place to move.
Tell us more about Pauline and about James. What's your recollection of them from your perspective, being a kid, but knowing the parents from visiting Pauline and Marianne?
So the mom, Pauline, she was a lovely woman. She played the piano. And if I recall correctly, Paula also played the piano. And I don't remember Marianne being musical. I just remember her being artistic with drawing and creative stuff like that. Pauline, I know that she was older than Mr. Pearson. That I do know. And the family had 2 dogs. I want to say they were 2 small little Pomeranian styles, or maybe Papillon or something like that. It was really funny though, Mark, because when she would play the piano, she would play like this. I remember her playing like this instrumental waltz type of a song, and it would prompt the dogs to start singing along, howling, So they would jump up on the piano bench, and she would play this thing, and she'd get to this part, and she'd tell the dogs to sing, and they would just start howling. And I'd never seen anything like that, and it was just really funny. Yet again, another vivid memory in the vault of my cellars of my mind here. But as much as Marianne was more social, Paula was far more serious. She was very studious. I don't really remember engaging much with Paula. She didn't babysit us or anything like that. I would attribute that to her being an 18-year-old that didn't have time to be messing around with some annoying 8-year-old kid living next door. She was very scholastic, but we will delve into her scholastic achievements later. But all in all, it did seem pretty much like an average family in the 60s and 70s.
And then what about James, Dad? What are your recollections of him?
So James Arthur Pearson, as I remember, he was a tall man, rather serious. However, again, it's not like me as an 8-year-old kid having conversations with him, but they would spend time with our family. And on occasion, my dad would golf with him, as Mr. Pearson was an avid golfer, and so was my dad. I do remember Mr. Pearson always calling me Georgie girl. My dad's name was George, and at the time, my mom had cut my hair really short, so I had this helmet head of hair. So he had given me this little nickname. One thing about James Arthur Pearson was that he resembled Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And this was one of the things that we'll talk later, is about the resemblance and how that would haunt him later. But he worked at a credit bureau in Santa Clara as the manager. And of course, it was an upstanding job with lots of responsibilities and clout. He wanted to give the air of being well-to-do. And from the outside looking in, that was fairly accurate. He drove a nice car. He had nice clothing. Marianne went to a parochial school. Pretty much all good stuff. But I don't ever really recall the father ever yelling or bickering or being upset at the girls or anything like that.
So basically what you're setting up is that this was kind of middle-class America, suburban life, neighbors talking to neighbors, friends talking with friends in the hood. What do you think changed?
The only thing I can recall even just really changing is that they had moved. And so the summers were ending. Our relationship changed. I mean, they were a mile away, but my mom wasn't allowing me really to ride my bike over there. In fact, we weren't allowed to really ride our bike over to the food villa, which was around the corner from their house. I think the thing that just changed was that they had moved, and then feeling sad and just really bummed out that they had picked up and moved away, and we never heard from them.
So your memory to all these events is pretty amazing, and it's pretty accurate. What I'm wondering about is, once they moved, did you have any other contact with them seeing around town?
No. The story of them moving, in learning what I know now of the abruptness of their departure, that would seem very strange. I mean, if you had a friend, yourself, if you had a friend that lived next door and all of a sudden they said, oh, the wife had to move and they're gone and they left already and I'm packing up my stuff and I'm going to clear out the house and I'm going to get out of here. Wouldn't you find that strange? I mean, you'd find that quite strange. Very
strange. And what caught my eye when you were describing it to me is that not so much that mom and the kids, quote, moved back east, but the dad stayed behind. And what was it that you told me, that he had contacted a neighbor to do something?
So the story that he spun was that a family emergency happened in Pennsylvania, and that's where Pauline was from, and that they needed to go back right away, and it was indefinite to know or understand if they were going to be coming back, but if they would be coming back, they wouldn't probably be residing at the house on Claremont. He had notified a couple of neighbors to help him clean out things. Based on his story that they were going to be moving back and be taking over some property, he wasn't in need of taking large furniture, and he was just going to be taking the basics and just pack up the car and drive out there.
So that was another interesting point that you brought up, is that they were actually renters and not homeowners. And that struck me as odd, because if he was in such a perfect job for him financially, and it was kind of a go-to job as far as in a small town, that they wouldn't own their own home or move that quickly to another rental for some reason. So that was odd and peculiar to me.
Right. We learned later also that he never really owned a home. That in itself is another twist and turn of how they moved around and sort of became the fabric of who he ended up being. So I promise that we will be covering that in detail in a future episode.
And you've also been able to contact some of the family members, which is increasingly interesting, of what they know or didn't know.
Correct. It's really interesting for the folks and the friends and the associates and the family of people who I have called and have told them who I am and the project that I'm working on, that everybody sort of has almost like a sigh of relief, and there's like a pause, and they say, yes, I do remember them, or yes, those were my friends, or yes, that was my aunt. So, I mean, I think everyone is just happy to hear that somebody is not forgetting them, because that is the main reason I'm doing this, is that my friend Marianne and her mom and sister never had an opportunity to really tell their story. And I want to be able to preserve their integrity and who they were. And being that this took place back in the late 60s, 70s to late 70s, it seemed like the story had ended once he was apprehended. So there's a little teaser for you that he did get apprehended. But this is on how we got there and how we're getting there is truly just going to be
a long and windy road.
Yeah. Yes, but how we get there is certainly a long and winding road.
I now remember you telling me that when you were first thinking about doing this podcast, that there was a Boston song that came on that really triggered your memory about how emotional you felt about Marianne.
Yeah, I had shared with you that I picked up the story and put it down over this series of many years. I mean, many years. But last November, I was in the car, listening to Pandora, whatever. And the song from Boston, More Than a Feeling, came on. And then snap. That was the thing that made me realize that I needed to move on investigating this story and telling their story. Each time I hear the song, I remember Marianne every single time. And if you know the song, you know probably that the name Marianne comes up. And by the way, it is spelled the same exact way that she spelled her name. And of course, I'm not going to sing the song. You don't want to hear me sing the song. I'm going to just take a second to recite the chorus and the lyrics of the part that really just gets to me, because this is exactly how, in just one little lyric, how you can really capture the feeling of Marianne and my memories of her. So in the song, it says, "So many people have come and gone. Their faces fade as the years go by. Yet I still recall as I wander on, as clear as the sun in the summer sky." And then it says, more than a feeling. When I hear that old song they used to play, till I see my Marianne walking away. And it gets me emotional every time I hear the song, and it catapults me back into the summer days where Marianne would take my brother and I swimming. And I just would always see her as a bright, shining little shimmer of light with her strawberry blonde hair and her light freckles and her contagious smile. So, yeah.
Which is one of the reasons we want to tell their story.
Right. So I thought, if I'm going to tell the story, it needs to be now, because this is the right time. And I said, people who I've interviewed have been just incredibly generous with their time to talk to me, and intrigued and very happy, very pleased to be able to assist in any capacity to help this story come together.
Just when you think the bodies under the house in 1974 was the only crime, it's not. The story with so many twists and turns and outcomes that you won't believe it. The mess that seems to follow James Arthur Pearson for almost a decade will leave you stunned. So what happened on September 22nd in the fall of 1969 at the house in Santa Clara? All that and more on episode 2 of Investigated.
Thanks, Mark, and looking forward to talking to you next week. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to follow Investigated on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, visit investigatedpod.com to visit our website to learn more about your hosts, Sonya Paz and Mark Kapschick. Follow us on social media and connect with us. Investigated is written, edited, and hosted by me, Sonya Paz, with story advisement and input from Mark Kapschick, and many thanks to the assistance of Clark Williams and Allison Betts Goldman for their contributions for the story.